All right, hello everyone. And again, thank you so much for joining me today. You are now attending the webinar, Phoneless, Tokenless, Passwordless, Less is More. My name's Kimberly Biddings. I am the VP of Product here at BioKey. Very excited about today's subject and jumping right in with all of you who have joined us live today. First, we always have to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So you are all in listen-only mode. We are going to be sharing a recording after the webinar, so definitely stay tuned for that if you want to share it out within your organization or listen to it after the fact. Also, if you have any questions at all, please use the questions panel as part of the GoToWebinar interface to ask any of those questions, and I'll open it up for a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. So the first thing I have to say is a disclaimer. One of the things that we're going to dig into today is passwordless authentication, right? Hot topic, something everyone's buzzing about. But I want to make sure that everyone understands that what really needs to be considered when you're thinking about authentication is what works for every user, right? We always say in authentication that one size does not fit all, and one method per person really isn't enough to give the people enough flexibility to log in and access what they need to get their job done, or as a customer, access your services, because sometimes those authentication methods may not work for them. Their situation changes, right? So what works for somebody, let's say 90% of the time, may not work for that other 10%. For example, I'm coming to you from Boston in my home office, but I travel a lot. And there's cases when, let's say I'm on a plane, or there's other instances when maybe I don't have cell phone service, for example. You want to be able to account for people's situations, because the best security is security that's adopted by the person. So I'm going to be pointing out the good, the bad, and the ugly for all different passwordless authentication methods, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a place and time to use all types of methods for your users. So keep that in mind as we go into the presentation, and I'll remind you at the end, of course, of that as well. So no good passwordless presentation is going to start out without talking about why passwords stink, right? First of all, just a little history lesson. They all were created or started to be created in the 1960s. There is some dispute on who actually created the first password. Most people attribute it to this individual, Fernando Corbato, who is an MIT researcher, but definitely started out of MIT, definitely from some researchers. And they were pioneering passwords actually, but didn't really care so much about them. They were really focused on creating their compatible time-sharing system, or what they called CTSS. Now, the very interesting part about the people who created the first computer passwords is that the CTSS system they created them for was actually hacked and had an issue in 1966. A software bug jumbled up the system's welcome message, the password file, the master password file, and so that anyone logging in was presented with the entire list of all the passwords. Now, that's not even the best story. The best story is that 25 years later, Alan Scher, who was one of the MIT researchers, seemed to have come clean and say it wasn't 1966 when these passwords were first hacked. It was actually 1962. So within 2 years of passwords being invented and brought into our world, they were actually hacked. So Scher was looking for really a way to bump up his time and manipulate that CTSS system. He had allotted some hours per week. It wasn't really enough. And he simply printed out all the passwords in clear text that were stored in the system. So again, passwords were created in 1960s, and really within about 2 years of them being invented, they were already breached. So now we fast forward to today. Right? Every time I give a presentation about passwords, I love to ask people how many do they think they manage. On average, we're all managing about 100 passwords or digital identities in our everyday lives. So every system you're logging into, every application, every mobile app, there are digital identities and or passwords associated to those. The other thing is that passwords, as we know, are responsible for close to over 80% of data breaches that are happening today. And to combat that, what we're doing is just making them more complex. Amazing enough, CISA just put out cybersecurity performance goals, or what they're calling CPGs, for critical infrastructure. And their recommendation for password complexity was to actually make sure that you have a 20-character password. Now, I'd say also, there's no way that most people can remember 20 characters, especially 20 unique characters and unique combinations. And so we're trying to prevent these hacks, right, from happening, but we're also getting to a capacity where people just can't remember or manage them. I love this chart because it's a great test for all of you on the line today. Think about what passwords you're using. Hopefully it's not just one password for 50 accounts, but you want to think about what's actually going into that password. And as you can see here, most passwords, until they're very complex and they get upwards of 10 characters or so, they're either instantly able to be brute force attacked or guessed by hackers, or it takes them only seconds, minutes, hours, even weeks. But again, we're not talking about anything that's sophisticated. A brute force attack is just simply guessing a password. And as you can see here, the bad guys have become very, very efficient at it. Now, the next question you probably have is, why in the world are we still using them, right? So why is this still the foundation of our technology? If they were hacked in the 1960s, right? Fast forward to 2022, why are we in them? Password-based authentication really overall has fewer compatibility issues. Implementation, honestly, is very simple. If they're hacked or forgotten, they're pretty easy to replace. You can reset a password, and you don't need to rely on additional hardware. And oh, did I mention that they're cheap, right? So those are the kind of decisions or the weighing of using passwords that's going into organizations as to why they keep using them. Of course, the cheap part, we always like to say, it's definitely not cheaper than experience a data breach, which at this point is pretty inevitable with passwords. So passwordless has really become all the rage. I joke it's like Spice Girls in the 1990s, right? Everybody's talking about it. There's webinars like this one. There's a ton of information about it. You can see here that gray line is actually search volume traffic, according to Google, from the beginning of 2019 until yesterday. So it's continuing to ramp up, and by area, geography, and even industry, that changes. Interesting enough, in 2019, as you can see here, the VP analyst, Ant Allen, actually said that by this year, Gartner was predicting that 60% of large and global enterprises and 90% of mid-sized enterprises will implement passwordless methods in more than 50% of use cases, up from 5% in 2018. So again, this is a common trend. This is a common conversation that's happening. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to spend the rest of the time looking at these very common passwordless approaches, and then an extra one that we really think you should all consider as part of your strategy, and that's identity-bound biometrics. Now, before I keep going and talking about the subject matter, I do want to open up a poll question to see how everybody is out there. So we're going to start this poll question. Where are you on your passwordless journey? So I'll launch the poll. You have the options, right? We've gotten rid of all passwords. You are passwordless, password-free. You've started your journey. You're still in research mode. You're not planning to go passwordless at all or anytime soon. Or you're a partner. I know there's some partners out there with multiple end customers, so may not apply directly to you. So keep filling it out. Looks like we have about half of you voting. Give you a few more seconds to provide some feedback. And this is going to be a great level set for all of us on this call, kind of get a feel for where you are in this journey that we're about to talk about, maybe why you're attending today. All right, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So we are looking at, none of you are completely password free. Understandable, again, I actually did not expect really anybody to be. There's some of you who've started your journey, about 8%. 50% of you are in research mode, may explain why you're joining me today. Not planning it, 17%, and a partner. We got 25% of you out there that are partners. So thanks so much for participating. Now, so we'll go back into an overview. So let's start first, being that 50% of you out there are in research mode, let's talk about what passwordless is, right? Again, it's a hype word, it's a big word. We're going to break this down. So simply put, it's about verifying a user's identity without the use of a password. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, there's two approaches that you want to think about when we're talking about going passwordless. And this is kind of an important point because I get asked a lot, is passwordless multi-factor authentication, right? Using more than one method in those three categories, something you have, something you know, something you are. And you can see here, there's really two ways that people go passwordless. One is they take that single factor, that single password, and replace it with something else, right? Another method, and we'll talk about what those methods are. In this picture, it's a security token. Multi-factor, they're replacing that password that's already in combination with another factor with something that's not a password. So in this case, you have a phone plus maybe a biometric that's being combined instead of a password plus a code from your phone. So again, there's ways to think about this. Passwordless is not always multi-factor. And so it's just important kind of to level set from there. Inherently, all of these things and moving to these new methods are inherently safer than passwords. But about what we're going to get into today is there are some methods that are more secure than others. And that's really where you want to pay attention to the trade-offs and the things we'll look at. Now, another thing a passwordless presentation would not be complete without is talking about FIDO. Okay, FIDO, or Fast Identity Online, is really that technology agnostic security specifications that's behind most of these solutions and most of the architecture that you see from some of these leading passwordless solutions. On the left-hand side, you can really see what goes into the baseline of FIDO, and it's essentially encryption, right? It's using the idea that someone unlocks their private key, that private key is then sent and matched with that public key as well to unlock the login or allow the person to have access. So again, very baseline in terms of how FIDO operates. And what's being layered on top of that is what are the methods that help unlock, right? Does that user approval to unlock that private key and match it with that public key pair. FIDO was actually created in 2009. It started from Validity Sensors and PayPal. And believe it or not, they were actually talking about using biometrics for identification instead of passwords. So that was the origination of it. By July 2012, the standard was actually founded. And in 2014 is when the very first passwordless standard was published. So that's really when things started to ramp up, take off, and people really leaned into passwordless is possible. So wide adoption continues. Some examples that you're probably most familiar with in your everyday lives are things like Apple Touch ID and Face ID. Those being allowed to, let's say, unlock your computer, unlock especially websites or web applications. The underlying crux of that is truly a FIDO protocol or FIDO standard that's allowing that interoperability. So it's been great to really set that foundation and standardize the underlying foundation of how we do passwordless. But again, what we're going to talk about today is, let's say you're committed to passwordless, or maybe you're researching, but what methods do you use, right? So FIDO is the underlying standard, but how are you actually going about doing this passwordless? Is this cryptography, these key pairs, the best way to go about it? With so many methods and so many choices, again, there's no single answer, but you need to make considerations in both the security and the convenience decisions that you're going to need to make when deciding what you're going to replace passwords with. Now, let's talk about what the methods are, right? We talked about that approval process or how these solutions are being implemented. And there's plenty of them out there, a lot of strong vendors out there saying, you know, we are the ultimate passwordless solution. But let's talk a little bit about what this is. So first of all, possession factors, right? Something that you have are probably I would say the most common methods at this point, or most widely adopted methods for passwordless. And so you can see here, phone-based, the reason it has three things underneath it is we've really centralized around phone-based authentication methods. You probably use these on a regular basis. So push token, right? That's when you say, I want to log in. It sends you a notification on your phone and you say, I confirm or deny that login request, and then gain access, again, password free. An authenticator app, like you see here, Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, is an app that's installed on your phone. When you open that application, you're given a code, right? A one-time passcode that usually expires after about 30 seconds. And you're to enter that into the field that you're trying to log into before it expires, right? So that's an authenticator app. And then SMS OTP was actually some of the very original phone-based method. And that's actually sending a clear text code to a text message on your phone. This has been very, very common for, let's say, access your bank account, accessing applications, and has been widely adopted for years. The other method that stands out is a physical hardware key. We offer FIDO keys, as we call them. A lot of people are familiar with the RSA secure IDs, which are some of the original ones. YubiKey is another one. And some of them have a code on the key that you type in, right, and that you generate and type in. Some of them are simply plugged into your device, your laptop, let's say, and you simply touch it to activate it or enter a PIN to unlock it. Again, on that hardware key, if it doesn't have that code, then truly it's got a certificate on there that's going to, again, unlock that private key, share it to authenticate that person. Other things we're seeing, magic links. So I just had actually a site I had to log into. You enter your username, they email you a magic link, you click on it and you're logged in. Those magic links usually expire within about 10 minutes or so. But again, it's usually via email or an email system. And then finally, certificates. So seeing a couple vendors out there coming out with these are also great for device authentication, but that's purely an actual certificate that's stored, let's say, on your laptop, protected in your TPM, and then that's actually going to be unlocked and sent in for authentication. But certificate-based is kind of the underlying of all of these for the most part, and then they can be used as the only method that you have. But again, most common that you're going to hear about when you're asking vendors or other people that have gone passwordless, they're going to talk about phone-based and they're going to talk about physical hardware keys. The other category that comes into play, and one of my favorite subjects being at BioKey, and we obviously do biometrics, is device-based biometrics. If there's one thing I can give this whole audience information about is device-based or local biometrics are still something you have, okay? They still fall into that something you have category in terms of what's actually authenticated to the relying party or to the organization that owns that application or that asset. You can see it here plainly from the FIDO documentation, right? So the user presents a biometric, they authenticate locally, so you can see here Face ID, Touch ID, Windows Hello. But what happens is it's only unlocking on that device that private key, and then the device authenticates using a public key cryptography, right, process. So again, they're still authenticating something you have, right? That's really, really important for obviously what we'll get to in a little bit when we start talking about options without phones and without tokens. Now, another poll question. So making sure you're all listening out there. Do you have users who cannot or refuse to use phones or hardware tokens? So I'm going to launch the poll. So your options are basically, I have users who cannot or refuse to use phones. I have users who cannot refuse to use hardware tokens, both, right? And then all my users can use both of those methods. Give everybody a few minutes. And again, this is kind of talking about, right, what I talked about in the beginning. People need options and not everybody works the same way. So loving this question, very curious. I'll give everybody about 10 more seconds or so. All right, so I close the poll and share those results. So I have users who cannot and refuse to use phones. 20% of you are saying that there are users that absolutely cannot use phones. There's 10% who cannot use hardware tokens. 40% of you are saying you have users that refuse or cannot use both. And then 30% of you are actually saying that users can use phones and or hardware tokens. So again, you're seeing that mix, right? That those gaps that are going to start being created if the only options you have are possession-based factors, such as a hardware token or a phone. Let me just get back to the presentation. Apologize. Just give me 1 second. There we go. Sorry about that. So we've talked about the factors. We've talked about common passwordless approaches, FIDO Alliance. You now have a good feel for what do we talk about when we're talking about passwordless. Now we're going to talk about some of these challenges, okay? So there are really 3 common challenges that you want to think about when you're thinking about what methods you're going to use and how you want to implement passwordless. So the first one that I'd like to highlight, and obviously very critical, is just insufficient security, right? So the issue with these possession factors is that trust is only being based on somebody's device, token, and those things can be shared, lost, forgotten, or stolen. So, you know, some of the crazy stories I've heard is hardware tokens were given to a contact center and they taped the hardware token to the middle of the floor, basically for everybody to peel off with the pin and use it for everybody. I've also equated it to if you are allowing somebody in your front door of your house, right? We equate multi-factor authentication with locks on a door. It's almost like you're opening the door to just a giant iPhone and saying, hey, come on right in, but I'm not sure who actually owns you, okay? So it's definitely challenging in the sense of where is trust being established and what are we actually trusting in general to access our services, our data, our critical pieces of our businesses. Now, SMS OTP, right? I talked about that code being sent to a text message. Look, it's been years that we've known that this is weaker security. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the main things is that these codes are sent in plain text, and we're now seeing and have seen that they're very vulnerable to SIM jacking, or when a hacker will take over a phone. The US National Institute of Standards and Technology, very affectionately called NIST, also proposed a ban on SMS OTPs in 2016, literally saying we should possibly ban this because it's not a secure method. Also, what just came out recently was a great article that was called 3 Minutes to Financial Ruin. And it was an article from an editor who just went through a SIM jacking experience. So it's fascinating. He's got all the details of all the codes he got, all the text messages he got from people. Essentially, somebody walked into Verizon, signed up a new phone on his account, and then intercepted everything that he was receiving to his phone, including these one-time passwords. So again, SMS OTP has very vulnerable parts to it. Now, still talking about the phone-based, the other thing is in March of this year, FBI and CISA put out an alert saying that as early as May of 2021, Russian state-sponsored cyber actors were actually taking advantage of misconfigured multi-factor authentication. And what that means is because all we're doing is trusting devices, these hackers find an abandoned account, request to enroll a new phone or a new token, and they now have control of the authentication process. So again, we're not trusting people, we're trusting things and possession things, and that's allowing for these bad actors to be able to enter organizations, especially when enrollment of authentication is misconfigured. The other thing is, it's not something that's very usable on a workstation or a kiosk when you have a lot of people using the same device, right, the same laptop. And so what happens is it's only verifying that device, that token, that's something you have. It's the same thing, one example is in healthcare. right? You have shared workstations. Sometimes they're called WOWs, COWs, workstations on wheels. And a lot of hospitals are using proximity cards. That's okay for some workflows. However, there's nothing that ties my proximity card to me when I tap it and I gain access to patient information, which obviously is very sensitive in terms of HIPAA compliance and other compliance standards. So again, there's not a great way to meet compliance with these type of solutions. There's also no tracking of the actual people that are behind these devices and tokens. Lastly on this subject is, what about those on-device or local biometric methods, right? So again, these do weakly link the user to the device, right? When you thumb in or Face ID into your phone, it has linked you personally to that device. Again, what is authenticated is still a certificate, right, in the background to the relying party or to the organization that owns the app you're trying to access. But the other thing is that, I don't know if you've noticed, but behind these biometric factors, if your Face ID doesn't work, what comes up? A PIN, right? A PIN can be the override for a lot of these biometric factors. And then anyone with a PIN can take over that device. So as much as they're used for passwordless workflows, a lot of time the default behind those things are passwords and PINs still, which obviously are very, very vulnerable. The last key part about that is that the user, the individual, is actually in control of the enrollment. So all of you can have a nice experiment today. You can ask someone, if you would like to, I want to enroll your face on my iPhone. And you're allowed to do that. There's no control from the person that owns the application, the relying party, as we say, to prevent that from happening. And so what happens is the organization that's trying to protect the data, trying to protect the systems, doesn't actually know if the original person that was enrolled is still that person, or if they've delegated responsibility or allowed unauthorized registration or enrollment on their own device. So again, on-device local biometrics, definitely not the same and falls into that possession category or possession factor category. The other thing is they're very high cost in a lot of cases and only increasing. So hardware tokens by far have this very, very high cost because they're these physical things that you have to manage. So remember, replacing them costs money, tracking them down costs money, managing them in terms of assigning, unassigning, monitoring them, all cost money. Not to mention, they range from $25 to $100. I think they've actually gotten a little cheaper than $25, but they require you to buy multiple tokens per person. And guess what? People lose them. So again, there's a lot of overhead and then repurchasing costs when employees turn over. So if you're a high churn environment, right? We hear this in contact centers, hotel environments. If you have high turnover, being able to issue 2 per person and then them leaving your organization is a lot of overhead and unexpected costs with hardware tokens. Now, the other thing is phone-based methods. So phone-based methods were very enticing because for a long time, it was fairly cost-effective. What we're seeing now is employees, suppliers, users in general are pushing back on allowing their personal device to be used for, let's say, an authentication from their organization as an employee. And so we're hearing things of, enterprises actually having to buy mobile devices, dedicated mobile devices for their employees, or there's actually requirements to pay for part of their data plan. And that's not to mention that you're actually liable if you wipe an employee's phone and it wasn't justified. I remember I was working at an organization. They asked me to use my personal phone, but they said, hey, if you mis-enter or mis-authenticate on your phone enough times, we're gonna wipe your entire device. And for most of us, that's our family photos, that's our memories, that's our personal social applications, everything. And so they had to issue me a second dedicated corporate device. Again, the phone-based method does come with friction and does come with increased cost. And then lastly, as convenient as these methods can be, right? And we're trying to get away from the inconvenience of remembering passwords. These approaches can absolutely introduce friction and be inconvenient. And even more importantly, implausible for certain groups of people. So from an inconvenience perspective, right? These methods, you have to always remember and carry your phone or your hardware token anywhere you are. If your device is lost or replaced, you cannot access that credential. Those things are tied to your device. It's local to that single device. There's actually a very popular vendor out there who's offering passwordless with phones. And looking at their documentation, if you can't get to your credential, you have to call your support desk, you have to re-enroll your single credential, and then you have to go do that on every single device that you need to access. So again, they're convenient until they're not. Lastly, we all have this experience, right? The convenience when you get a Face ID to log in, it's wonderful. We're like, great, we don't have to type in that password. But accuracy of those scanners and accuracy of those biometrics is much lower, and oftentimes will reject the scan. And then guess what pops up? That PIN or that password you then have to remember, which you may not have needed to remember for quite some time. Now, the other scenario, and this is why I asked that poll question, is the implausible scenarios, right? Where it's just literally not possible to use those type of methods. First of all, no cell phone service. There are plenty of customers I've talked to, for example, higher education. There's a whole building on campus that gets no cell phone reception. So some of those methods that rely on that are not feasible. Traveling, right? Like I said, I was traveling, I had to get an offline method that if my phone's in airplane mode that I can still log in. And then people refuse to use their phone. Flat out, full stop, they just refuse to use their personal device for a number of reasons. The other thing I found interesting is there's a huge portion of people out there that have smartphones, but guess what? There's also a substantial portion that do not. According to Pew Research in 2021, 60 to 80% of certain groups have smartphones, but that means that 20 to 40% of them do not. And it ranges by if they're rural, if they're of an age group, a demographic, right? So you have to consider what people actually have available to you. The other big use case we see is that these things are not safe to have, that you cannot carry, hold them, or anything because it literally produces a risk. I was talking to a huge enterprise manufacturer. They have a zone in their plant that allows no batteries. Literally, there's an explosion risk for having anything with the battery in it. So again, these are scenarios that have to be accounted for that the most common approaches can't support. And then finally, your security policy just forbids it. A lot of cases, especially in certain work environments, you are not allowed to bring your phone to work. Contact centers are a great example of that, right? For security reasons of data, those workers are not allowed to actually bring anything in terms of a smartphone. So again, it's important to think about that there are going to be situations, as you all highlighted in the poll, that these common approaches just will not work. And then finally, at a very high level, I just want to make sure that you all know that this also is documented. And it's not only documented, it's documented by FIDO themselves. So this was a white paper last year, April 2021, that talks about the life cycle of these authenticators. How do you manage them? What do you need to do to manage them? Couple highlights from here. One is they absolutely require in writing that you should supply multiple FIDO authenticators to prevent user lockout. Guess what? That comes with a cost, right? Again, that's that multiple tokens that you need to supply. The other thing is they're already recommending that a remote biometric, which we'll talk about, is something that you should use to verify somebody's identity before giving them a replacement authenticator. So you're using a centralized biometric to issue an authenticator that's something possession-based. And you'll see why when we talk about identity-bound biometrics for passwordless, that you could skip the step of the thing that you have to possess, right? You can use biometrics actually as a full passwordless solution. The other thing is that cost-benefit analysis, right? We've talked about this when users leave. The idea is that you want them to have them ship it back to you, send that token, especially that hardware token, back to you. And what happens is there's just a lot of overhead, a lot of friction, and oftentimes it just doesn't happen. So again, there's that unexpected cost of having to constantly reissue and manage those tokens for everybody. So today we're talking about a different approach, right? A phoneless, tokenless, passwordless approach, and that's using identity-bound biometrics, okay? So we talked about some of the most common methods. This is one that I think it's not as discussed as frequently, right? But it has a very specific purpose and an amazing solution and level of trust to it that definitely you should consider when you're thinking about your passwordless journey. So identity-bound biometrics is all about creating that centralized biometric identity that literally verifies you anywhere, on any device, any location. And so nothing is actually bound to the device. It's actually binding that person to their unique biometric identity. So it is centrally stored biometrics, completely non-reversible hashed, right? Very, very strict session management. Every scan of a biometric in this case is an individual session, so there's no keeping sessions open or replaying those. And there's multiple ways to capture those biometrics, whether it's on a fingerprint scanner, or we do a mobile auth that does palm scanning and facial recognition. Now, the crux of this, why this is so important, is that you cannot hand it over, share it, forgot it, or steal it. Again, this is something I am, right? This is in that category finally of authentication that no one's really getting to, of something you are. Now, it's also controlled by the enterprise for enrollment. So again, that whole part we talked about with the local biometric and me saying, go try with Face ID or Touch ID to enroll somebody else, you cannot do that with a centrally stored biometric. The enterprise always remains control of the enrollment, which by the way is really easy to do. It's a simple enrollment process one time, and then again, that can be used across all different locations and devices. It's absolutely perfect for situations where phones and hardware tokens, again, are not going to work, are not reliable, not safe, or the employee just doesn't want to use them. And then finally, very affordable and easy to implement. So for example, instead of multiple tokens and a lot of cost and overhead, it's a simple one-time fingerprint scan, gets put into the laptop or the desktop, the workstation, and that's a one-time investment. It's not going anywhere, it doesn't get lost, it doesn't get stolen. Again, this is a single investment, usually around $40 is some of them, and then you're done. You place those at all of your desktops or give them to your employee, and it stays plugged into their device, almost like a dongle for a wireless mouse. So very easy to use, very cost effective to implement. So let's talk about how it works from a technology perspective. This is passwordless desktop login. I will highlight, I'm using desktop for a reason because we'll talk about those shared workstation use cases. Obviously, this can also be done from a browser prompt. So it can also be done when you're in a browser trying to access the web application. So in this case, the user opens their laptop and scans their fingerprint, okay? What happens is that biometric, the fingerprint capture, gets algorithmically changed, encrypted, etc., and is actually validated on our WebKey server. So what we're looking at is that biometric blob, right, data blob that was originally enrolled, does it match the actual biometric that's been scanned? Once it says, yep, we have a match, PortalGuard, our IDP, is going to initiate that login with a workstation, initiates the domain login, and then the user's granted access in the background using NTLM or Kerberos. From there, the user gets single sign-on to all of their applications, web-based, on-prem, doesn't matter, but they get that SSO now that they've actually authenticated and proven they are who they say they are. From the user perspective, it's just a fingerprint scan. So again, walk up, by the way, no username is required, scan my fingerprint, does one-to-many matching, and I'm instantly logged into my laptop, and I can easily access single sign-on to all my other applications. So again, very easy to use, very cost-effective, and actually one of the only ways to do these use cases in some of those situations. So let's talk about the benefits, right? We've highlighted some of those, we've gone through some of those. First of all, from a security perspective, you heard me talk about trust. Security is all about that sense of trust and level of trust. And when you're doing the identity-bound biometric, you're actually able to positively identify the person that's completing that action, not just a device or token, and that intended user and only that intended user is able to access the system that they're going into. That also means that you have a full auditable activity log that gives comprehensive records of logins, record updates, tracking of user systems, application access. Now, the one thing that this can do that none of those possession factors can do is validate steps in a process. So this is very important in industries, manufacturing, banking, really across any that you have transactional business. Because when you actually authenticate that person, you're authenticating that person did the action. So what happens is, for example, we have a manufacturing customer. They not only use that to log the person into the workstation that they're on, but they also use it to verify that Joe is the person that completed the step of that manufacturing process. Or, for example, that student is the one in the online exam who's actually taking the exam. So again, that goes well beyond the benefit of just removing passwords and logging people in to actually verifying steps of a process and that those people who are supposed to complete it are the ones that did. Easy to use. It's very, very, very convenient. It's frictionless. Again, it's a one-touch authentication and you have access across every workstation or a one scan, right, with some of the other methods that we offer. And then very cost efficient. You heard me say it's a one-time cost for that fingerprint scanner. It's very minimal, it's easy to purchase, and it's easy to deploy. So again, very simple, addresses a lot of those pain points that we all have with the common methods, those phone-based security token methods we're looking at. So to bring this really home, I wanted to talk about the use cases that we see this really taking off in. Now, it's great for all kinds of use cases, right? Pretty much I ask people, well, where do you want to be sure the person is who they actually say they are? And the answer is usually everywhere, right? But there are definitely cases where it's actually not possible, like we talked about, to carry phones and tokens. These are just a few examples. So banking, right? Shared workstation across branches, across locations. You have tellers that you want to make sure did a certain part of the transaction, a manager that completes it. Those are very key use cases in any type of bank, financial institution, credit union. Manufacturing, I talked about that, completing a step of a process. Also, oftentimes those environments are absolutely not safe to carry extra tokens and definitely not a phone. Contact centers or call centers, very high turnover. Again, lots of security policies and not being able to bring a phone in because there's been cases of people taking pictures of personal information and actually selling it. There's a lot of regulations on that. We've also talked to people with hotel front desks, right? Retail business, restaurant businesses. So there's a lot of use cases out there where this is pretty much the only passwordless option that's going to work for your users. You can see here, Orange Bank and Trust is one of my absolute favorite customer stories. In 45 days, they deployed a fingerprint scanner at 2,000 desktops. They had passwordless authentication for all of their employees across 11 branches. At any device, any workstation, those employees can walk up, scan their finger, and they're in. So amazing use cases where IBB, Identity-Bound Biometrics, supports the use case. Now, the last thing I want to say about passwordless methods, authenticating, is there's this extra layer that we all need to start thinking about, right? If you're just starting on your journey for multi-factor passwordless, you're trying to get your arms around that strategy, this may come a little bit later, or it may be something you want to tackle at once. But what really becomes powerful is when we start bringing context to every authentication decision, right? The reason that's so important is it doesn't matter as much what the method is that you're using if you're pulling in all kinds of risk signals around that person that's about to authenticate. So this is an example. I log in at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time where I live in Boston. I'm on a known network and a known device. Again, possibly my authentication does not need to be as strong. A phone-based method may be okay for that use case. In 2 hours, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, there's now a login attempt on my account for an unknown network and device, and it happens to be coming from Russia. That's an attempt that you want to block. Doesn't matter what method you're using, doesn't matter what, who the person is or where you think that, is actually going to happen, what methods you use you want to block that attempt. There's no way that I got from Boston to Russia in 2 hours. I mean, that would be really incredible, but I don't think that's possible yet, right? So that's all about bringing in context and actually adjusting the authentication you're giving people based on where they are, their network, their IP, their geolocation, and then other risk signals about even their device. So again, that's something that most enterprises are moving to, more advanced cybersecurity programs are moving to, that we're not just relying on methods, but we're also building in this context of risk around each attempt. So I will wrap up. I want to mention everything we've talked about, by the way, is in what we call our BioKey Portal Guard Identity and Access Management Platform. It's award-winning. It supports employees, customers, and suppliers. And again, it is the only platform on the market that offers all those methods, but also integrates and has that seamless identity-bound biometric capability. So when people ask me about it, I say, look, it's one of the only platforms out there that offers something you know, something you have, and something you are, categories of authentication. It's also full single sign-on, full self-service password reset, and then we sell our own fingerprint scanners and anything else you need to essentially capture those biometrics. You can see here, again, it's really important to give people options. So out of the box, we offer a whole range of authentication methods, but you may be thinking, well, we already have something like Duo, or we have something like YubiKey or Microsoft Authenticator. And what PortalGuard is able to do is pull those in and integrate those in so that you're easily managing a simple security policy to decide which factors each person is allowed to use. We also support contextual authentication. That's pulling in those risk signals, right? Looking at the network, looking at geolocation, and augmenting the authentication based on those contexts. So again, very easy to use, offers all of the options that we just talked about out of the box, as well as the unique offering of this identity-bound biometrics to address those use cases. All right, so that's all the presentation I have for you today. I definitely encourage you to scan the QR code. The first one is a blog post all about Passwordless, a lot of what I talked about today, but also going deeper into the content. And please subscribe to BioKey's blog. We'll be adding articles. We just added one about shared workstations and kiosks, and we'll continue this conversation around Passwordless. Also, if you're interested and want to check out PortalGuard or discuss your multi-factor authentication or passwordless strategies, especially for those of you researching, please schedule a discovery call with us or contact me directly. Now, we will open it up to questions. I know we have a few of them coming in. So one of them that I got is about PortalGuard deployment. Is it on-prem? Is it cloud? How does that work? And so PortalGuard can be deployed on-prem. It can be deployed fully as an IDaaS or identity as a service solution. And then it also is, our biometrics will work in even air-gapped networks. So if you have some really unique use cases, really unique situations, we can also support that. One of the questions is, identity-bound biometrics and FIDO the same thing? No, they are absolutely not. So FIDO is, you have to remember, is all about cryptography, right? Private key, public key pairs being matched and unlocking to allow people to log in. With us, Identity-Bound Biometrics is all about that biometric being matched, something the person actually is, to unlock and allow them to log in. So again, the big difference is Identity-Bound Biometrics is really the only way that you can verify the person behind the computer screen or the person behind the device. And let's see. How can you have more than one authenticator? If an authenticator is device bound, you would not be able to share your private key with other devices. Yeah, so on that one, in the FIDO standard, what they're talking about is issuing multiple security keys. So they're actually saying, just like any of the hardware token vendors, and if we sell you hardware tokens, which we do sell, we do provide, we would tell you should get 2 per person. So again, it's having a backup authenticator or a backup method. More so when they're talking about the physical hardware tokens, again, having to buy at least 2 of them per person. So what would the authenticator be exactly? If I use a PIN to unlock my phone, so I can sign my challenge with my private key as the authenticator, the interface of the phone. Not sure I fully understand that. So what's happening is usually something's used to have the user interact to unlock their private key. So that may be a Face ID, that may be a Touch ID, that could be the authenticator code that you're typing in. Some of them don't necessarily have a private public key pair. Not everything out there is FIDO. So for example, those SMS OTPs aren't necessarily a FIDO backend. But that question, Elizabeth, I can answer offline too. We can also go deeper into that. CISA recently said FIDO was best for security, but nothing on biometrics. Why? That's a fantastic question. So the best thing about FIDO, so I tread lightly with FIDO because I think they've done amazing things for modernizing authentication and getting away from passwords. Passwords stink, right? That's the first thing we talked about. FIDO, though, was founded mainly by device manufacturers. So you have to remember, they are a lot of like Apple, Microsoft, right? A lot of these organizations that founded FIDO and started FIDO are device manufacturers. And that's really a lot of the leading reason I think their possession factors are taking hold. FIDO doesn't highlight biometrics, the centralized biometrics, because again, the backend that they're using is based on private, public, right, key pairing and cryptography. But in that white paper, like I highlighted, interesting enough, if the method for FIDO gets lost or stolen or something happens to it, the person loses it, they actually recommend using a centralized biometric, right? An identity-bound biometric to verify the person is who they are before you go give them, let's say, another hardware key. So FIDO is a little bit more discreet about it. A lot of it, if you think about it, the local biometrics, the device-bound biometrics are tied to the device and sell more devices. Relying only on biometric as a single factor, best practice dictates MFA. What other factor is recommended? That's a great question. So from a use case perspective, it really depends on your user. Again, passwordless is replacing a single factor password with a strong single factor. That's what I just outlined with, let's say, the fingerprint scan, and then you get logged into the machine. With MFA, it really should be something, a combination of multiple categories. So it should be one thing that you have, one thing that you are. So you can do a biometric scan, and then you could use a security key, right? One of those hardware keys. You could do a biometric scan and a phone-based method, such as an authenticator app. Most people, when we're talking MFA, Gartner, interesting enough, I just spoke to one of the analysts there, and he's like, a lot of things are password plus. What we call multi-factor, again, not on the passwordless thread, but most multi-factor implementations, even the ones we're doing, people are still having that password plus a biometric. Again, I would recommend that you go to something much easier to use and depending on the user, such as a fingerprint scan, hardware key, fingerprint scan, authenticator code, and stay really away from the, the SMS OTP. The other thing to remember is that if you are doing, let's say, a local device biometric and then doing a palm scan with our mobile auth, that's not only centralized biometric, but also local biometrics. Now you have two biometrics, one something you have and one something you are. So again, John, it really depends on each user. If you want to map out by user, we're happy to do that at any point. What would you say there are any downfalls, risks to FIDO? Elizabeth, another great question. Honestly, I think we have to be aware of who created the standard and what the standard is actually doing. And again, overall messages, we're removing something that you have to know, a password that's faulty. But by doing that, replacing it with just phones and tokens, we're moving to only authenticating things that are possessed and not, or somebody has to hold on to. It sounds like they're possessed. That they have to hold on to. And so my big stick at BioKey and just in general from being in this industry for over a decade is we're removing people from the equation, right? We're not authenticating the person behind the device, the person behind the token. And so I think FIDO has a lot of adoption. They just had a massive conference talking about all the amazing use cases. but what's not really highlighted about it is what are you ultimately trusting at the end of the day? Is it the person, or is it just something like their phone knocking on the front door of your app? It's definitely something to consider. And again, like I said, I think all methods have places. It's always depending on how much risk is present, how sensitive the information is, right? All those things have to go into what you want to use. If cloud-based, you have to have internet to use, not for the desktop. So Brent, we have a desktop client-side install. Again, we can work in air-gap networks. We can work on-prem. We have obviously fallbacks and features built in so that if somebody's offline, they're not locked out from their computer, right? So caching and obviously an architecture on the desktop side, but more than happy to dig into that with you as well. What do I think about passkeys? I think they're interesting. Look, I use Face ID every day. I think passkeys are an interesting way to start using some of these methods across different browsers, different areas. I'm pretty sure at least the Apple methods are specific to Safari, or at least they were when they first came out. Again, it's a convenience method. So I think in some cases they're great to use, and in some cases they're not enough. And in some use cases, they're not even feasible to use, right? Like we talked about on a shared workstation or a kiosk. All right, is it always fingerprint that needs to be used? Nope, so fingerprint hardware, scanner plugged in has been the standard method for most centralized biometrics. We now offer a phone app, so if your user can have a phone, then you can actually do palm scan as well as facial recognition or facial scanning. And then we're looking at voice and other methods. Again, depending on the situation, there are situations you can't have a phone at all, and then it would be fingerprint is really the best, most cost-effective, easiest thing to use. All right, well, do some laptops come with an acceptable fingerprint scanner? Brent, another great question. So believe it or not, our fingerprint scanners are actually Windows Hello certified, and that's because there are laptops that don't have fingerprint scanners or don't have fingerprint scanners that are sufficient to scan. Whether or not we can use a fingerprint scanner that's native to the laptop really depends on the scanner that's available. To be honest, a lot of times it's going to require a dedicated fingerprint scanner. And that's because a lot of the local or device-based scanners, if you look at their surface area, is very small. Mostly it's for convenience and things like that. When we do a centralized biometric and a matching, we collect thousands of data points about that biometric. And to do that with the scanner technology, you have to have a big enough print or big enough surface area. And that will change what kind of accuracy that you have or don't have. So again, we have some really low profile ones. We also have FBI FIPS compliant scanners that have a huge surface area for a greater capture. So the answer is sometimes the laptop has an acceptable fingerprint scanner, and sometimes we actually have to augment, let's say, a local device-based biometric like Windows Hello because there isn't an acceptable fingerprint scanner. Can the camera on laptop be used for a palm scan? We are working on it as we speak. One of the big things when you're doing this type of biometric is liveness detection. And so when we use our mobile app, you'll actually see a flashing, right, to do that liveness detection. I know that we are looking at palm scanners, either if they're built into the laptop or a peripheral device. The best use case I can tell you to prove that it's possible is Amazon is actually piloting Whole Foods to use palm scanning for payment. Not our technology, but obviously proving out that use case that it's very easy to do, simple, hold your hand over and actually scan that palm. So definitely looking at that, Brent, and looking towards other devices and hardware solutions to solve that, not only for palm, but also obviously facial scanning as well. All right. Well, hey, awesome questions. I am at time. Again, my name's Kimberly Biddings, VP of Product here at BioKey. As you can tell, love talking about this subject. A lot of you are out there researching. If you have any questions, you want more information, want to see IBB in action, please let me know. You'll get a recording following the event. And otherwise, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join me. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks so much.